Good morning. This is Andy Mueller. I'm the General Manager at the Colorado River District. Thank you for joining us today for our first live webinar. With me is Chris Treese, and today Chris and I will be discussing some issues of great importance on the western slope of Colorado related to the Colorado River and its administration. We will be presenting for about 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll have a 20-minute question and answer session afterwards. When asking questions, we would ask that you write them in on the right-hand side of your screen and submit them, and we'll do our best to go through all the questions we receive. It is possible that we may not be able to answer them all, and so in that event, we will get back to you after the seminar. One thing I want to touch on is that today's program is only an hour, and so if you're intrigued by what we're talking about or think of it as vitally important to your community, we would encourage you to consider attending our seminar in Grand Junction on September the 14th at Two Rivers Convention Center. That's going to be from 9 to 3, and the cost of attendance is $30, $35 after September 4th. It includes lunch and has some panels of great speakers and really intense conversation about Colorado River issues. So today, again, I would encourage you to ask questions during the program. If they come up to you after the program, come to you afterwards, please feel free to email us. Registering for our seminar can be done at coloradoriverdistrict.org. We would encourage you to do that. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to lay the foundation for our program. Here you go, Chris.
Thank you, Andy. This is the voice of Chris Treese. You won't see faces anymore until we move on to the question and answer period in the last third of our webinar. I want to welcome all 200 plus participants to this first ever River District webinar. We look forward to many more, but we appreciate you being part of our premiere. My job is to set the table, is to create a common ground, a common language, ensure that we have a common starting point for Andy to continue a discussion that I will introduce, and which we look forward to all of you continuing in the question and answer and days beyond. The Colorado River Water Conservation District. Most of you know us as simply the Colorado River District or even the River District. The River District was born in conflict 81 years ago. We have remained largely in conflict one way or another for those 81 years. 81 years ago, the Colorado General Assembly created the Colorado River District to ensure that Western Colorado always had a voice whenever and wherever the Colorado River is under discussion. We were born in the controversy surrounding the then proposed Colorado Big Thompson project. Still the largest federal trans-mountain diversion project, taking water from the headwaters of the Colorado River to eastern Colorado, northeastern Colorado, to the municipalities of northeast Colorado, and on out the South Platte all the way to Nebraska and the farmlands along the South Platte. The Colorado River District is all of 12 and part of 3 West Slope counties. Together with the Southwestern Water Conservation District, our sister district that covers the Dolores and San Juan River Basin, we represent all of the Colorado River or all of the tributaries that drain eventually to the Colorado River within the state of Colorado. The Colorado River District covers the land area from the Continental Divide west to Utah and from the north slope of the San Juan Mountains north to Wyoming. The General Assembly wisely chose to define our boundaries by river basin. We are everything that drains the Yampa River, including the Little Snake, everything that drains the White River, the main stem of the Colorado, and the entire Gunnison Basin. We're the largest special district of any kind in the state. We're 28% of the land area of Colorado. As all of you know, we call this the better side of the mountains, where 80% of the water falls primarily as snow, but only 10% of the population resides. In eastern Colorado, they are essentially the mirror opposite. They only get 10 to 20% of the water. They've got almost 90% of the population of the state. The Colorado River District is governed by a 15-member board of directors. One director appointed by the Board of County Commissioners from each of our 15 states. We are funded by a small mill levy, just a quarter of a single mill over the large 15-county area. We also, in compliance with the Tabor Amendment to the state constitution, we have a water enterprise fund. The water enterprise fund we use to develop, market, sell water, and occasionally water rights. Primarily that water is water that we have developed in reservoirs or shared in the development and own shares or portions of stored water in reservoirs. Many of you have heard me describe the Colorado River District as the provider of the legal, the technical, and the legislative representation for Western Colorado. We support Western Colorado water uses and the beneficial development of water in Western Colorado. We are the watchdog for the Colorado River. We hold and develop water rights for the benefit of Western Colorado. We have assigned many of those water rights for others to develop. We control water in various reservoirs throughout Western Colorado for municipal, industrial, agricultural, recreation, and environmental beneficial uses. We have a dual role, however, as assigned to us by the General Assembly in our Organic Act. We have an interstate role to represent all of Colorado and protect the waters to the Colorado River to which the state is entitled under the 1922 Compact. We also have an intrastate responsibility within our district to ensure that Western Colorado is represented and water is developed when, if, and how Western Colorado chooses. We describe ourselves as the David between two Goliaths. We have the populous Eastern Front Range, water from Western Colorado, from the headwaters, providing water supply to the municipalities in an almost unbroken line from Greeley and Fort Collins south to Pueblo. We also have demands from California, Arizona, and Nevada, thirsty metropolises in those areas, as well as agriculture in those basins, in that lower basin. And speaking of the lower basin, I want to describe just briefly the Colorado River Compact to ensure that we're all on the same page for future discussions. The Colorado River Compact negotiators in the early 1920s set out to divide the Colorado River among the 7 states of the Colorado River. They failed in that task, deciding instead to divide the river between an upper basin and a lower basin. The upper basin states are Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. Lower basin states, Arizona, Nevada, primarily the Las Vegas area, and California, Southern California being the direct user of a significant amount of Colorado River water by an additional series of trans-mountain and trans-basin diversions. The dividing line between the upper basin and the lower basin and the measuring point for compliance with the compact is at Lee Ferry, Arizona. That's just below Glen Canyon Dam, of course, forming the Lake Powell. The important elements and the numbers you hear most often from the Colorado River Compact of 1922 are included in Article 3 of the Compact. The first recitation is Article 3A. Says there is hereby apportioned in perpetuity to the upper basin and to the lower basin the exclusive beneficial consumptive use of 7.5 million acre feet every year. Then in Article 3D, in potential conflict, and certainly providing plenty of challenge, it says the states of the upper division will not cause the flow of the Colorado River at Leaf Ferry to be depleted below an aggregate of 75 million acre feet over every 10 consecutive years. Importantly, that 10 consecutive year period is every 10 consecutive years. This is the 10th year looking back in 10 years. It's also the first year of the next 10-year period, limiting the amount of flexibility that 10-year provision provides. Now I'm here to tell you it's dry outside. Everybody knows that. Nobody lives in Colorado that isn't painfully aware of just how dry it is. On the left is a weekly drought monitor that we watch very carefully. It tells us what we all know, that it is exceptionally dry throughout western Colorado. Southwestern Colorado is in what characterized as an exceptional drought. Extremely dry conditions throughout not only western Colorado, but throughout the West, throughout the Colorado River Basin of note, but also even in the normally in the normally wet Northwest US is in some form of drought throughout everything west of essentially the 100th meridian. In looking out for the future conditions, these two graphs provide a forecast for temperatures on the left, which show above average temperatures forecast through the month of September, and the drought index or the drought outlook through November is for continued drought in the Southwest. This lighter tan area is designated as slightly improving conditions, but that is reflective, regrettably, of the very severe conditions that is the baseline from which the arid Southwest is starting. Now I want to turn it back to Andy Mueller and let him talk about what some of this means in current conditions and our activities and conversations with our interstate partners sharing the Colorado River. Andy?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. I want to talk a little bit first about Lake Powell. Lake Powell is a federally owned reservoir located in Utah, just above the Grand Canyon. It is our savings account, the Upper Basin savings account. And it is important and serves a very important function of storing water during wet years and allowing us to release the water during the dry years to meet that obligation under Article 3D of the compact that Chris just referred to. It served us extremely well over the last 18 years during this record drought that we're experiencing. Now, I want to have you look at this graph and kind of explain what we mean by that. So remember back in 2000, we had just come off the late 90s. We had some pretty good water years, and Lake Powell was almost full. It had over 23 million acre feet of water. We then experienced a 4-year drought that at the time was one of the worst droughts that we had seen in the Southwest. During that 4-year period, Lake Powell dropped down to just over 8 million acre feet of water. That 8 million acre feet of water put us at severe risk of being able to meet our compact requirements in the future. But luckily, and it was luck, the hydrology picked up, and up until about the beginning of the 2012 water year, it gained back up, had about just over 18 million acre feet of water. At that point, again, we suffered the drought in 2012 and 2013, drawing the reservoir down to below 10 million acre feet. Today, this graph doesn't show it, but we expect the reservoir to end this water year at the end of September, once again at below 10 million acre feet of water. Keep in mind that as our savings account, it's incredibly important to keep your account full. If we were to repeat the drought that we had between 2002 and 2004, starting next year, we would be unable to meet our compact obligations. That's why this chart is so scary to people like me and Chris when we sit here and look at and talk about the water. So the question is, who's using the water and what's going on the Colorado River? It's fairly simple. You remember Chris said that in 1922 they divided the water roughly 7.5 million acre feet for the upper basin, 7.5 million for the lower basin. Well, let's look at what really happens in today's world. We have about 4 to 4.5 million acre feet of consumptive use in the upper basin. The state of Colorado uses roughly half of that, and the remaining 3 states in the upper basin use the other half. In the lower basin, they have the 7.5 million acre feet that they are using out of the main stem. Then they have an additional 1 to 1.5 million in evaporative losses that are not included in that 7.5 million. That's an overuse that we consider strictly an overuse. They sometimes refer to it as a structural deficit. The lower basin tributaries, which are treated very strangely in that compact, mean that they are actually using another 2 to 2.5 million acre feet. So the total use in the Colorado River in the lower basin is about 10.5 to 11.5 million acre feet of water. Now remember, we've got to add in that international obligation for the country of Mexico, and that's about 1.5 million acre feet. So when you get done, that river is basically being depleted at about a 16 to a 17.5 million acre feet per year. I think that number is scary when you want to look at the next chart, and it's a confusing graph, but if we can walk you through it, I think you'll understand. This solid black line or gray line here that the cursor is on is the running average to date. It is at no time substantially over 15 million acre feet. Even back in 1922 when the compact was signed, and it was an extremely wet period of time right before that compact was signed. At that point, the running average was just around 15 million acre feet. Remember though, they divided 15 million acre feet and had an unspecified obligation to the country of Mexico. That's why today, when we talk about what's actually being depleted from the river or being demanded of the river, it's actually 16 to 17.5 million acre feet. Hard to do when your running average is at or below the 15 million acre foot level. Now, when we look at the 10-year moving average, it becomes even scarier. That 10-year moving average in our recent times is well below 15 million acre feet, putting us at a significant deficit. And that helps describe why our reservoirs over the last 18 years have been dropping. So what it has to do with is not only this overuse, but it's also the amount of water coming into the river. So let's talk about first the overuse down in the lower basin. This is a slide I want to point out that is not one presented or prepared by the Colorado River District. This is a slide that I took off of the Central Arizona Project's webpage. This isn't the infamous slide where they told us recently that they were gaming the system, but this is one where they talk about what they think is a structural deficit, which is different than what we do. So if you look at it, they're saying, hey, between themselves, those lower basin states and the country of Mexico, they're only using 9 million acre feet. But we, under the compact, are only releasing 8.23. Well, first of all, under the regulations that have evolved since the compact was signed, we oftentimes release the 9 million acre feet as required by federal law. What's really not included in this chart is the 1.3 million average acre feet of evaporation that occurs in the lower basin, transit loss and evaporative loss. So when you add, they claim there's a deficit between the 9 and the 8.23 million. We're actually saying that deficit is well over 1.5 million acre feet. What else is happening on the river that is affecting these reservoirs dropping? We think it's climate change. And recently published studies estimate that the flow of the Colorado River is extremely sensitive to temperature. In fact, what's happening is as our growing season gets longer and our days are hotter, both earlier in the morning and later in the evening, is that agricultural crops, riparian natural vegetation, and even those invasive species are growing longer, faster, and consuming more water. And what that means is there's less water making it into the river and less water making it into Lake Powell. Now, Brad Udall and Jonathan Overpeck did a fairly intense study on this. They found that by mid-century, we should expect a 20% decrease in the inflow into Powell, solely based upon the warming temperatures in the basin. By the end of the century, that drop could be as much as 35%. So that's a significant problem for us. But I want to focus back on Colorado for a minute, and then we'll get back into what that means to us in the basin. It's important to understand for everybody, and certainly for those of us at the River District, where depletions occur within the Colorado River Basin. So within our state, we are experiencing depletions that occur in this fashion. The vast majority of the water is actually consumed by West Slope Ag. We see about 1.3 million acre feet of water consumed every year in our agricultural economy. We see another 360,000 acre feet consumed by the East Slope municipal and industrial uses. The East Slope Ag, which Chris referred to in both the South Platte and the Arkansas River, that consumption is about 180,000 acre feet of water. And then our West Slope municipal and industrial demand is approximately 77,000 acre feet. So in that total pie. Now, why is that important to understand? Well, it's important because if at some point we fail to meet our compact obligations to the lower basin, we could end up with a call or a curtailment that comes up the river from the lower basin. They basically, just as a senior user would in the state of Colorado, they would call to the Department of Interior and say, hey, we're not getting our water. And at that point, the Upper Colorado River Commission, which is our 4 Upper Basin states, would evaluate the message from the lower basin and from the Department of Interior, and they would announce that in fact a curtailment is necessary to meet the Upper Basin's obligations, that non-depletion obligation to the lower basin that Chris talked about. So what does that mean? Well, it means that potentially all post-compact water rights, so any water right that was created after the compact was executed, is at risk of being turned off in order to produce enough water to go downstream to meet those obligations. And for years, our West Slope agriculture has said, well, that's great, because primarily most of our water rights in the West Slope Ag are pre-compact. Of that 1.3 million acre feet that is used every year in West Slope Ag, about 1.1 million of that is pre-compact. And so historically, our farmers and ranchers have felt very comfortable knowing that we have protection from a compact call. The problem is not in the nature of our water rights on the West Slope. It has to do with this growing purple piece of the pie. That's the East Slope municipal and industrial use. That East Slope municipal industrial use has grown almost every year since 1922. And as we see in northern Colorado, as the ag area out there is being urban, changed into urban and suburban landscapes, we're seeing that demand, and from a water user or water supplier's perspective, what that is that's a hardening of the demand. Those are taps that lead to people's faucets, or water supply that leads to people's faucets. Those are water supply that leads to people's fire hydrants. It no longer is an agricultural entity that could be shorted on water in one year but have a perfectly viable year the next. It is a hardened demand in which water is important for the health, safety, and welfare of those residents that year. We do have some growing West Slope municipal and industrial use as well. And then there's the East Slope Ag, which is diminishing as that purple piece of the pie grows. So to further the problem, if we end up in a compact curtailment, we will end up in a situation where at some point we can see the curtailment coming, and a reasonable water manager for a municipal and industrial program, someone could be on the Front Range at Denver Water, it could be another Front Range entity like Colorado Springs or Aurora, or frankly, it could be one of our West Slope municipalities who have junior compact water rights, or water rights that are junior to the compact. And they see that curtailment coming, and it's not a possibility, but say it becomes a probability. What they would reasonably do is go out and find pre-compact water to buy and be ready to use as augmentation. And from our perspective at the River District, that's the worst thing that could happen, because it would mean that our West Slope ag is further at risk of having it bought and dried in a permanent sense. So what are we doing about that? And what do we, why do we care? Well, two things really, and these pictures actually illustrate my point. On the left in the current slide is actually Crowley County in southeastern Colorado. Back in the 70s and 80s, Crowley County farmers and ranchers sold out their water rights. Many of them were bought up by the Front Range municipalities, and in its wake, Crowley County suffered one of the most searing economic crises. Their community fell apart. Their school districts were unable to fund the educational programs. Families moved out. It's what we don't want to happen on the Western Slope in terms of protecting our communities. What also could happen, for those of you on the phone who are representing municipalities, is having severe non-voluntary permanent water restrictions on parks and outdoor watering and vital urban landscape that provides value to all of your citizens and taxpayers. And so we see this compact curtailment as a possibility, given the levels in Powell and given the current hydrology and the predictions about climate change. And we say, well, what can we do to improve or to protect our chances of avoiding any kind of a compact curtailment? Well, a couple of things that we're doing. The first is a risk study. Some of you may have heard our district, the Colorado River District, and our sister district, the Southwestern District, together with our 4 basin roundtables on the Western Slope, have conducted so far phase 1 and phase 2 of a risk study. And the risk study is trying to figure out what risk the entire state is at with respect to a compact curtailment, and what steps can be taken to lower that risk. And so right now, if we don't do anything, if the Upper Basin says we're not interested in changing the way we use our water, and the Lower Basin says we're going to continue to overuse the water and continue this structural deficit, what's going to happen? Well, our risk study says that we have a real possibility, given standard estimates on future hydrology, that we have between a 10 and 20% possibility of being unable to meet our compact obligations. So that's having Lake Powell drop to a level that would be 35-25. So that's a mean sea level average, or height above sea level. So that's at 35-25, we believe that it becomes hard to get water through the turbines that make the power in Lake Powell. And once you can't deliver water through those turbines, you actually are unable to deliver enough water downstream to meet our compact obligations. It is not something that would happen overnight, and I want to stress it's not something that's going to happen next year. It is something that will be a very slow moving train wreck. We'll see that coming literally years off, and we see it beginning now. We see that beginning to be a real possibility, and so the idea is, from our perspective, is what can we do to reduce the possibility of it happening? Well, one of the things we can do is and I'm going to flip to the next slide and come back to this one just to talk about it a little bit. There are drought contingency plans that we are developing both in the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin. The good news is the Lower Basin's draft drought contingency plan involves, or includes, I should say, a restoration of the almost the exact amount that we believe they are overusing in water. So about 1.1 or 1.2 million acre feet of water, once their drought contingency plan is in full force, would be restored back into Lake Mead, or not depleted from Lake Mead. We think that's a great start, and we applaud the Lower Basin for doing that. In the Upper Basin, we've got a three-legged plan that we're putting together. And the first is really critical, and that's the reservoir reoperations. We have the Colorado River Project Act created three main reservoirs other than Lake Powell, the primary units, and that's Blue Mesa here in Colorado, Navajo down on the border of Colorado and New Mexico, and Flaming Gorge up in Utah and Wyoming. Those three reservoirs, if we reoperate them, in other words, move water from them down into Lake Powell, will allow us to sustain the levels in Lake Powell for a year or two in a critical drought year. So it extends our protection and our ability to continue to deliver water and make power in Lake Powell for at least a year longer, maybe even two, depending on the hydrology. Additionally, the second leg is that we are going to continue our cloud seeding efforts and augment snowfall. So there's lots of cloud seeding going on both in our district and the Southwest. We are, I will tell you, studying the science on that. There's lots of evidence that that cloud seeding actually does increase the precipitation or the snow water equivalent in a given event, but we haven't been successful at accurately and dependably measuring the amount of water that it actually adds to the stream. So we're working on that, but at the present time we are engaging in that because it's not a very expensive activity given the potential benefit. The third leg of the stool is something called demand management. This element, I want to tell you, is a little bit controversial. This is where we are actually studying, and we're not in a program, we're not moving forward with it. We are studying what would happen if we get water users across all spectrums and across all traffic locations, and that means West Slope, East Slope entities who depend upon the Colorado River, municipalities, ag users, in industry, to intentionally reduce their consumptive use of water. And take the intentionally reduced water and put it into a special account at Lake Powell or another reservoir where we, the Upper Basin, controls the function or the release of that. And the question is, well, how do we do that? How do we do that and make sure that we continue and protect our crucial agricultural economy and the tourism and the recreation that depend upon that agricultural economy? How do we make sure that we're not reducing the consumptive use to such an extent that our ag industry actually becomes irreversibly harmed? So we're looking at that. We're trying to figure out what sideboards are most important. Today, what we can tell you is that if it's ever going to move forward, our position on this is that such a program must be voluntary by the farmers and ranchers and cities. It must be temporary. In other words, not permanently taking land out of irrigation. And it must be compensated. Those landowners and those municipalities must receive compensation for reducing their use to supplement and pay for or help create the economic stimulus that would normally have come from growing a crop or having that valuable urban landscape as lush as it may be under normal conditions. We also are very, very assertive that West Slope agriculture cannot be the sacrifice zone. We want to see anyone with a straw in the Colorado River within our state sharing in this product, in this production of demand management water. And the most important part of this, and I touched on it before, is that conserved water has to be banked in a place that we, the Upper Basin, control. Because without that control, we've seen that the lower basin entities, like the Central Arizona Project, will just game the system and send the water down into their canals. We need to be able to preserve it and use it for our protection. Now, if I go back a little bit to this risk study, what does that mean? Well, we've studied that demand management may actually be needed under certain scenarios, under certain future hydrologies that we can imagine. And when I say that, I mean, if we repeat the same hydrology that we've had between 2000 and 2018, and we just overlay that on the next 18 years, I can tell you that we're going to need demand management. If on the other hand, we have a hydrologic record that goes from 1956 to the present, our need for demand management is less. because there are more wet years involved in that. Now, the indications from the climate scientists and from NCAR and from NASA seem to indicate that we should not expect a continuation of the hydrology that we've seen since the 20s or the 50s, but that we should more likely anticipate something that's closer to the hydrology since the year 2000. So we know that we've got a risk. We also have to keep in mind, by the way, that we all in the Upper Basin want to see continued economic growth. And for years, decades, centuries, frankly, we've all equated growth and economic prosperity with increased water consumption. And frankly, when we study just a 10% increase in the Upper Basin depletion, it doubles the frequency that demand management pool or releases will be needed to protect us from a compact call. So we need to be aware that if we're going to grow in the future, which we at the River District fully support growth and a viable economy in the Western Colorado, we need to find ways to grow that don't include additional water use. And we think there are lots of ways to do that. It's going to require a lot of creativity, a lot of cooperation among ourselves on the West Slope with our Eastern Slope brethren. We're really going to have to get creative on that. Now, additionally, how much water do we think is going to be needed? Well, our studies show that we may need in that bank, in that demand management pool, as much as 1 to 2 million acre feet of water. So we know that we can't produce that in 1 year. We know that that's got to be produced and banked over years, just like you would if you were saving to buy a house. You would start, and several years later, you might have enough to put down on that house. We would anticipate a demand management program, if it ever exists, would need to be built up over time through these voluntary compensated measures. And it needs to be protected so that we can keep it where it is for our benefit when the hydrology proves necessary. I want to touch a little bit on some of the things that we're going to face and you're going to face as our community's leaders. We should anticipate Colorado's population increasing to about 8.5 million in 2050. That's a more than 50% increase from 2015. So that growth needs to occur in the state of Colorado without additional significant use or additional consumptive use of water in our state. How do we do that? That's going to be up to you guys as community leaders. It's going to be up to us to help you figure that out. But there are a lot of things that we're going to have to look at and be willing to think about that haven't been even things we could approach. And I'll tell you, land use is something that the water community has historically viewed as a third rail. We didn't want to touch it. We didn't want to get electrocuted by it. We have deferred to local municipalities, given your land use authorities. We want local land use control. And while we support that, we also entering this new phase of our hydrology and looking at temperatures as they rise here in Colorado. We have to understand that land use does matter. And as we're converting ag use into suburban and urban uses, we need to consider the effects on the overall river, especially if we want to protect our Western Slope ag. So how do we do that? Well, local land use ordinances can be modified to provide incentives for people not to plant curb to curb Kentucky bluegrass. And that's true whether it's in Windsor, where that use is 100% depletive causes 100% depletion to the Colorado River because it's a trans-basin use, or in Grand Junction, where it may only be a 50% depletion to the river. What we're asking of our land use authorities is to consider incentivizing low water use landscaping, and in many instances potentially requiring that as we double by more than 50% experience a more than 50% growth. So I want to finally touch upon where you can learn more, and we have a seminar coming up on Friday, September 14th. We've titled it Risky Business on the Colorado River. I think you've gotten a sense today why we think it's so risky and the risks that we're facing. But that day-long seminar at Two Rivers Convention Center in Grand Junction will, if you attend, will really delve into some of the bigger details that we're facing, both on the big river and within our state. We would encourage you to attend. We encourage you to participate and ask questions. And speaking of that, we at this point, we want to open the floor up to questions. I see some have come in while we've been on the webinar, and Chris and I will answer those. We really appreciate those of you who are going to log off during this question and answer period. Thank you for everybody for coming. But if for some reason we don't address your question during this question and answer period, please feel free to email us or contact Chris or myself directly. Gotcha. Well, welcome back. So we have some questions here. The first question is from a gentleman in Newcastle asking, how would municipal providers be affected by a compact call? Are we at risk of curtailment as well? And I think it's a good question because a lot of our discussion centers around Western Slope agriculture. And it's important, especially if you're a municipal water provider or an entity that provides water to urban and industrial uses on the Western Slope, to understand that it is potentially problematic if you have in your portfolio a significant number of post-compact water rights. I would encourage you to contact your own engineers and your water council. Look through those water rights that you hold and understand that in the event of a curtailment, it is possible that your available water supply would be curtailed or diminished by the state engineer's office in the event of a call. Now, I want to stress again, compact curtailment has never occurred on the Colorado River. If it were to occur, it would be several years out. It is not a certainty that it's going to occur. We don't want to sound alarmist. At the same time, it is important from our perspective that our municipalities and water providers on the Western Slope understand their risk and be able to assess it and act intelligently in a way that would protect themselves and their customers. So yes, we are aware of water providers on the Western Slope who have a significant percentage of their water rights that are post-compact. If we can turn to the next question, it appears to be a question from someone here in Glenwood Springs, wondering if we can touch again on demand management. How is it going to be administered and what needs to happen in order to protect West Slope ag? Well, I think that's a really good question. And the key to the first part of that is, what is it? And I think stressing that demand management is just a reduction, intentional and voluntary reduction in consumptive use of water. So it's consuming less water. And in the area of a municipality or a municipal industrial use of water, it means instituting drought restrictions when maybe you wouldn't normally do that, and creating an amount of water that would have been consumed but for that intentional action. And then the key component of that is taking that water and putting it into a pool where it is used for the protection of the Upper Basin and for the state of Colorado. It needs to be in a pool somewhere that doesn't just go down the stream into the system and benefit lower Colorado River water users. The question about how it's going to be administered and what needs to happen in order to protect West Slope ag is a really complex question, and it's one that honestly we're going to delve into in great detail at our seminar. But I would say this, that at this point in time, we don't know how it's going to be administered. There is no such program in existence today. It is likely that if such a program is created in the state of Colorado, that it will be administered by the CWCB and the state engineer's office, working in cooperation with the conservation districts like the Colorado River Conservation District and the Southwest Colorado River or Southwest Conservation District. It is, in terms of what needs to happen in order to protect the Western Slope, we have a number of criteria that we've been out discussing. We've mentioned them in this seminar, but some of the key elements of that are that it needs to be voluntary. It needs to be compensated. It needs to be temporary. It can't be done through permanent buying and drying of agriculture. And most importantly for West Slope Ag, it needs to have geographical equity. So entities on the Front Range with straws in the Colorado River have to engage in conserved consumptive use in the same proportion to their use on the overall river, just as the West Slope would participate. And so how they figure out what the voluntary nature of that looks like on the Front Range would be up to those Front Range communities and water users. On the West Slope, we're focusing on how to develop a guided market that would allow those who want to participate while also limiting or mitigating any secondary economic impacts on the communities that depend upon the agricultural economy. Hopefully that answers some of the question. Chris, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, just to underscore some of the things that Andy said, I think that what we know is that it would be chaos on the Colorado River if we have a Colorado River interstate compact call. And the Colorado River is the river of statewide use in the state. And so it's going to affect everyone. Therefore, our efforts right now are principally focused on not mitigation of the event of a compact call, but how do we avoid it? How can we put some water away? How can we avoid a compact call, or at least push that off as long as possible? The continuing decline in the lake levels that you all read about at Lake Powell and Lake Mead are extremely concerning. The Bureau of Reclamation continues to increase their probability projections for shortage declarations for the lower basin coming out of Lake Mead. Not yet for us, but gives us some small window where we can act. And that's what we're focused on right now in the demand management and other efforts, is looking at how can we avoid that chaotic situation, avoid the crisis.
Great, Chris. I would completely agree with what Chris has said. The next question is coming from a gentleman in Steamboat Springs, asking a really relevant question as to how might resort communities and recreation-based economies be affected by curtailment? Would ski area water rights be impacted? Well, I would say that if a curtailment were to be allowed to occur, if we don't act proactively and prevent it from occurring, the answer is yes. Most likely, ski area winter water rights used to produce snow are, to my knowledge, either all or almost all post-compact uses of water. So to the extent that they engage in consumptive use of water when they're making that snow, that post-compact use would not be protected in the event of a compact curtailment. How the state would actually administer those water rights, again, I want to emphasize, has not been fully disclosed by the state. The state engineer has the authority, and so exactly what would happen to a particular ski area water right is unknown. But the economies, not just in our agricultural-based communities, but also in our recreation-based counties here in the River District and on the West Slope, are at risk in terms of allowing a compact call to occur. And that snowmaking is a great point there, and it's one that it emphasizes the importance of what ourselves and the Southwest District are doing on behalf of the West Slope when we're engaged in these discussions to try to prevent a call from ever occurring. Chris, I'm just looking at this next question for you, and that is that the state legislature last year passed a handful of water reuse bills, and this person out of Denver actually wants to know, how can reuse on the Front Range help to conserve our statewide consumptive use?
That's a great question, and it is timely. The legislature passed 3 bills and failed to pass 1 bill, or defeated 1 bill, but it allows for and clarifies reuse of water. It's important to remember first that only certain kinds of water are reusable, and it's trans-mountain diverted water, or water that's produced into the system, that you can use and reuse, as the saying goes, to extinction. Most water, when you're directly diverting from the stream, is only one use. You use it for whatever your designated beneficial use is, whether it's a municipal use or an agricultural use, And then you need to allow whatever you can't use in that particular beneficial purpose to return to the stream. In the reuse, for that which is allowable, legally allowable for reuse, the legislature facilitated the process for reusing water for municipal purposes, primarily for toilet and urinal flushing, as defined in the statute, and for certain irrigations or for irrigating certain crops. And that will allow, that improves the ability to reuse water, facilitates that process. That hopefully will result in less water that has to be diverted from the west slope to the east slope. So it is timely and it is helpful. I will note that the Colorado legislature continues to look at other areas where they can help in this process of water banking, of demand management, looking for the institutional limitations or facilitations that would assist the process of planning for or mitigating against a compact curtailment.
Thank you, Chris. The next question is a question coming out of the Gunnison Basin, wondering what's going on in Blue Mesa this year and asking specifically what the projected low elevation will be at the end of this water year. I want to just state before we talk about the elevation that the inflow into Lake Powell during the critical April to July runoff period was 35% of average this year, a total of 237,500 acre feet of inflow. And according to the Bureau of Reclamation's current numbers, they believe at the end of this water year, at the end of September, we're going to be at 34% of capacity with 279,000 acre feet left in the reservoir. That's 34% capacity. A mean elevation for those who pay attention to those numbers of 7,443. So not a good sign at Blue Mesa by any means.
It's worth noting that Blue Mesa, our largest reservoir in the state, definitely was hurting this year in terms of fill. Notably, most of the other reservoirs throughout the state did fill this year, even with a poor snowpack, primarily because of a drop in demand, a relatively wet summer last year, and therefore they entered the year, reservoirs entered the year relatively full and managed to fill. That has helped us throughout this year. If we've drawn down those reservoirs, however, to manage the drought, if we end up with another dry year statewide, we're going to be looking at numbers and conditions much like Blue Mesa.
So the next question comes from one of our listeners. It says, can retaining conserved water in the Upper Basin be accomplished with existing storage facilities? And I would say this, that can it be? Probably the answer is yes, but is it a certainty at this point in time? No. And that has to do with the legal ability of the Upper Basin to store water in Lake Powell in a way that's invisible to the current regulatory scheme or framework that provides for the equalization of Powell and Meade. Today, there is absolutely no way for us as the Upper Basin to store water in Powell, despite the capacity being there and the availability of space in it. There's no way for us to put it in that reservoir and keep our Upper Basin control on that. Now, a number of entities, including the state of Colorado, are working on proposing federal legislation that may result in the ability of the Upper Basin to do exactly that in Lake Powell. But as we know, federal legislation is never a certainty. So at this point, we think it's still a good idea for us to be looking at other storage vessels, availability of use. We have looked at the initial reservoirs, crisp operating reservoirs, the three I mentioned earlier during the presentation. We can store some water there, but frankly, not a tremendous amount due to the operating constraints of those reservoirs. And that's true with most of our privately owned reservoirs that are currently in existence. So being able to store the water in Lake Powell is probably our best shot, or perhaps even a new facility or facilities. And I would say this, that regardless of their use for demand management, there are reasons that in certain basins on the western slope, we may need or do need additional storage vessels to help with and mitigate the impacts of the variable water flow that we're seeing and the change in the runoff seasons caused by climate change. So we may actually need buckets higher up in our basin to help control and help with stream health, help mitigate that human-caused actions on the temperature. We also may need to be able to provide more water to some of our historically direct flow agricultural ditches and municipalities that don't have large storage vessels up above them. That's kind of my thoughts on that at the present time. I would say that we're going to be able to take maybe one or two more questions here. We have a number of questions, and as I said, we'll get back to you. We did have a question about how Arizona was gaming the system, and I think that's something that I mentioned. So I wanted to just get back to them on that. We had a system conservation pilot program trying to figure out this conserved consumptive use issue, this demand management, and that had been going on for the last 3.5, 4 years. And it became apparent, well, frankly, the Central Arizona Project bragged about it on their website and indicated that they were playing the regulations, the operating criteria that exist between Meade and Powell, and they were timing the release of their deliveries out of Lake Meade to keep Lake Meade at a certain level in order to force a larger release under those regulations down into Lake Meade from Lake Powell. It was a difference of about just over 750,000 acre feet a year. They basically called it a sweet spot. It raised the ire of just about everybody up here in the Upper Basin, as well as the Department of Interior. We're hoping that the message has been received loud and clear by the state of Arizona and the Central Arizona Project. I think there's probably one more question we can take, and I apologize if we haven't answered all of your questions. I think the next question comes from somebody in Moffat County, wondering if we can foresee statute changes to give hardened demands by growing cities priority over existing senior water rights. I would say that I don't see, and maybe Chris, maybe you can speak to this. I don't see statutory changes, but I see problems with the way our Constitution allows for that to occur already. So Chris?
Well, I think that we will see, I mean, we have seen legislation introduced but not passed. I think we will continue to see considerations for demand, primarily municipal demand, and I think land use. I think the land use is the next bridge that we need to cross in the water community. We need to cross with the land use community. And I think some of that is going to be, changing our regulations and certainly our expectations with regard to lawn grass, turf, that we no longer will have or certainly not require in homeowners association requirements, fence to foundation lawn, bluegrass lawns. And I think providing both incentives and restrictions on the amount of lawn in certain cities can make a significant difference. When we talk about reducing consumptive use, reducing the amount of bluegrass lawns, especially in the municipal areas, can make a significant difference.
I want to give Chris an opportunity to plug our keynote speaker, who's just been announced at our seminar. And Chris, if you would, I think you know this gentleman personally pretty well.
Well, we do. Rifle native David Bernhardt, who is the Deputy Secretary for the Department of the Interior, has confirmed that he will be our keynote speaker at our seminar. We're very excited about David's participation with us, and we encourage everyone. As you know, the Department of the Interior is the department within the federal government that houses the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Bureau of Land Management, and several others of importance to Western Colorado and importance to the Colorado River. I look forward to having David out here to directly address many of the questions that we all have regarding policy priorities and directions from this administration and for at least for the next couple of years.
And that's our seminar on September 14th in Grand Junction. You can register for that at coloradoriverdistrict.org. I do want to take this opportunity to thank our staff, primarily Alicia Frederick and Zane Kessler, Lucy Wilson. They did a fantastic job putting this together. Chris and I put them under a lot of strain to make sure that we got this done right today. And we really appreciate their help. So thank you very much for tuning in. We will get back to any of you who have asked questions that we haven't been able to answer during this live session. Thank you for attending. We look forward to doing many more of these. Thank you.